welcome to Contact. I'm Craig Delahunt, and on today's show, our guest is Joe Foy, forestry campaigner for Western Canada Wilderness Committee. Thank you very much for joining us, Joe.
Well, good to be here again, Craig.
Joe, for years you've been saying that our forest cut is unsustainable. How's what's happening in small towns like Golden now bearing that out?
Well, this is a case where you don't like to be right. We've always hoped that we would have been able to get the cut down before communities start hitting the wall. But it looks as though Golden is one of our first communities to really hit up hard against the overcut.
Now, how did Evans' forestry practices lead to what's happening now? 500 people just been laid off?
Well, because it all gets back to tenure, because the provincial government allows large areas of the forest to be controlled by companies like Evans, and then sets low stumpage rates, we don't get the manufacturing that we should be getting out of our wood, which means the rate of logging is too high to try and get jobs with very little manufacturing. And we end up taking all the easily accessible trees first. So it means that down the line, you're left with just very expensive trees to log.
So they were actually accused of creaming, is that what that?
Well, Evans's job was to cut down these old-growth trees, and their whole strategy was to make them into low-quality commodity products. Well, you don't get that much money for those things, so to be able to pay their bankers, they had to get them as cheaply as possible. So that meant creaming and cutting at an unsustainable rate.
Are we seeing this happening elsewhere in the province?
We're seeing it happening all over the province, where large companies control large areas of the forest, and instead of producing high-quality manufactured goods, they're shipping out commodity items like 2x4s or wood chips or cants or pulp.
Are there a lot of little towns that are right on the edge that basically would?
Well, I would say there's a whole string of them. I mean, Boston Bar, for instance, is one of those towns where you had a very large mill there owned by, first of all, BC Forest Products, and then BC Forest Products flipped that to Fletcher Challenge, and then more recently that's been handed over to J.S. Jones. But it's a large commodity mill, and the valleys are mostly logged out. Aren't
a lot of these small towns actually blaming what's happening on the fact that any wood that is still left is not as accessible because of the environmentalists?
Well, that's certainly the line the companies have used for years. They use the environmentalists as scapegoats to allow them to continue to be able to log at an unsustainable level. But eventually you hit the wall like they've done in Golden, and then everyone can see it's basically they've logged it too quick.
Your group and many others once said a lot of these big internationals would quietly slip away once the best was gone. What do you think about the fact that Fletcher Challenge is now divesting itself of almost all of its assets and seems to be leaving the province?
Well, of course, it's already happened in other areas of the province. In fact, the Golden experience has already happened. The difference is, in other areas of the province, particularly the southwest, the population growth has been so fast as to sort of mask it. Where I grew up in the Fraser Valley, BC Forest Products and then Fletcher Challenge were all active in the Upper Pitt river country. They were active all along the north shore of the Fraser River in the valleys like Lost Creek. And when those valleys were logged out, they moved on. They've disappeared. And they've sold off to smaller companies who essentially work on the guts and feathers. What's different now is that we're seeing that over a larger area of the province, as a larger area of the province gets logged out. And, Fletcher Challenge is just doing what these companies have been doing for decades now, moving on, moving north, as a matter of fact.
Well, they were reneging on their promises to basically stay in an area for a while and be responsible for the mess they've made?
Well, of course they're reneging on their promises. The problem is that, we get the government we demand, and unless people stand up and demand a change in tenure, and that is, unless they demand that the forest be taken back, these companies will completely log them out and move on. That's what's been happening. And so far, the only way that's got a large company out of town is what's happening in Golden. So far, the people haven't kicked the company out. That may happen in places like Clayoquot Sound, where there's strong community support in the communities of Clayoquot Sound for local-based forestry, not multinational forestry.
How many years do we have left at the rate of cut we're doing right now in BC? Is there a lot left? Some people say 7 years, 10 years.
Yeah, well, in the southern part of the province, of course, we've already gone past that, or in a place like Golden, we've gone past that. In the north, there could be several decades left at this high rate of cut. That's the sad thing, that you can get the fiber out. The price we would pay for that, though, is astronomical. In loss of grizzly bears, in loss of salmon, we've already lost well over 100 separate races of salmon that we'll never get back up and down the coast.
Just for those that don't know, can you describe the interconnection between the salmon, how the salmon actually feed the forest and the forest provides habitat for the salmon?
Well, every school kid knows that the rough cycle of a salmon, that the salmon spends years out in the ocean but always returns to the same stream where that salmon was born. And that means every stream has a special race of salmon. Now we have the coho salmon, the sockeye, the spring salmon, the chum salmon, pink salmon. But I'm talking about, let's say, the cohos. Every stream that has coho salmon has a different race of coho salmon. Now, those streams depend on the old-growth forest for the habitat there. The big logs where the water comes over a fallen log, it creates plunge pools. The roots of the trees hold the soils in place. When we clear-cut an area like this, we change for the first time in thousands of years the very nature of the stream. The stream, once it's clear-cut, the forests around it, the stream will erode and get wider and shallower. The water will get warmer. Key spawning areas will get buried in silt. And so we've had many streams change so much. Whole races of salmon have been eliminated. This is as an almost incomprehensible loss of genetic diversity. We don't know down the road what this is going to do for the whole species of salmon.
So you think this type of logging has been a large contributor to this collapse of the fisheries?
Oh, it's no question. It's not the only contributor. We also have the fact that we've moved from a terminal fishery, that is, native people, when they controlled the fishery, all fisheries were done close to the spawning ground so that each race of salmon was fished at a level it could sustain. That doesn't happen anymore. We now have a European ocean-style fishery where the big nets scoop out the salmon out of the ocean, and we're never quite sure what streams we're scooping. And so, with the size of the nets now, it's actually possible to scoop up an entire stream's returning salmon. And in fact, some streams have been entirely wiped out because of our reliance on the ocean fishery.
And if they don't get it that way, the logging finishes them off.
Well, you've got the logging on the habitat, and certainly for some types of salmon like the coho, which we have a lot of coho streams. Coho like the small streams in the flatlands, and that's where we like to live. So that every time we bury over a wetland with just seemingly insignificant little waterways through it, when we're developing for a shopping center or a housing development, we've lost a lot of races of salmon that way too.
Now, 2 years ago, you went up to Barkley Sound to see how the new Forest Practices Code was affecting logging, and you weren't very happy. Can you tell us about that, and can you tell us if you've seen an improvement since?
Well, I was absolutely shocked when I was in around rivers like the Klanawa and the Sarita. And what people have to understand is while the large companies have the tenure, and what tenure means is they have control over the large tree farm licenses, they're just interested in meeting their bank payments. And they're far away from people. And when, even someone like me who's seen a lot, when I went out there, I was absolutely shocked. Because we've heard that logging practices have been getting better, and as far as I can tell, they're getting worse. Because like we've seen out in Golden, these companies they only know how to put out the commodity products. They're not putting out finished products, so they're not getting a lot of money for their products. and they're really pushed with their creditors. I saw big, beautiful rivers like the Sarita and the Klanawa absolutely trashed. I mean, criminal. Big pools filled in with silt, big landslides coming down the hillsides. Take your breath away.
Well, what about the Forest Practices Code? I mean,
well, the Forest Practices Code, we've
was it evident?
Had a close look at it. Evident? Well, not the way the Forest Practices Code is being presented to places like Europe or when the government tells us what the Forest Practices Code is supposed to do. The Forest Practices Code, if the Forest Practices Code were a shark, it would have one tooth. The rest of the teeth are gone. And even now, the industry is working to try and remove that single tooth. They think it's too hard. But you see, the Forest Practices Code is written so that the district manager can override. The Forest Service manager can override just about any part of the Forest Practices Code if the district manager wants to, get the logs out. And as we've seen with Evans, companies will push because of economic reasons to get district managers to override the code.
Well, the NDP's in a bind. We're all in a bind. We have a huge deficit. We didn't expect to be in the red this year, especially before the vote. The NDP's talking about taking the Forest Practices Code and modifying it, as you said, in favor of industry. What's that going to do to logging practices?
Well, the first thing we have to remember is that, our house is in a bind. My house, my family is in a bind. A lot of British Columbians are in a bind. We're trying to get our debt down, our family debt down. We got to pay the mortgage. We got to pay for the phone bills. But there's some things we don't do. And I'm not going to sell, for instance, I'm not going to dismantle the roof of my house and sell it for the price I could get for the roofing material. I am going to cut back here and cut back there, but the things that keep us safe, I'm not going to dismantle. We live out of our forests. Our forests provide us our fishing industry, our tourism industry, and can provide us a timber industry. This government, by not having a strong Forest Practices Code, by not breaking up the tenure and getting free enterprise back in the forest, is dismantling the very house that shelters us.
Along those lines, what do you think about the fact that they're dipping into the Forest Renewal Fund, which was set up to basically rectify damage or help people in towns that were basically like Golden? The fact they're dipping into that balance the deficit.
It's unbelievable. Once again, it's taking away the things that can make this province work. Look, you've got good, honest people with skills that want to work. You've got a black legacy of damaged salmon streams, unreplanted lands that have happened since the sympathetic management days of the 1980s. Lots of work, basic work that these people could be doing and want to do. It's absolutely wrong that money was taken out of the forest renewal funds, because it could have put those people to work. Those people would pay taxes. They wouldn't be pulling off of welfare or unemployment insurance. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is what they've done.
Now, right now, you're working on one of the last areas left in BC that hasn't been totally compromised. And you're not very happy at the moment with what's happened with the repack decision. Can you tell us about the area and why it's so important?
Well, I think what you're talking about is the Stoltman Wilderness Area. This is the largest wilderness area in the Lower Mainland. It's 260,000 hectares. It's the size of Clayoquot Sound, and it's only a 3-hour drive from the 1.5 million people in Vancouver. It's just 100 kilometers north of Squamish. It has grizzly bears in it. It's got 4 big wild valleys, and it should be preserved in its entirety. It's in an area where tourism jobs far outweigh logging jobs, and where the growth of the tourism industry is spectacular.
Now, the government has just made 24 new park areas. Wasn't this area included, or a good percentage of it?
Well, that's right. The provincial government has just announced 23 new parks, but they only set aside, they only granted park protection to 20% of the Stoltman Wilderness. And the most important parts of the Stoltman Wilderness, the Delahunt Valley and the Sims Valley rainforest areas, were given totally to International Forest Products to log. And we're digging in our heels on this one. We're going to fight this one.
Now, hasn't the head forester said that there's nothing really unusual about that area? Or?
Well, you know, we always hear that. We heard that on the Stein and Carmanah. I mean, the Stoltman Wilderness is the front line of our grizzly bears, our coastal grizzly bear populations, for gosh sakes. At one time, grizzly bears existed all down the coast of North America to Mexico. They've been shot, they've been poached, their habitat has been wrecked. So now that the most southerly coastal grizzly bear populations are in the Stoltman Wilderness. And the beautiful rainforest valley of the Delahunt is the center of that population. That's their front line, and it's a front line that the Wilderness Committee is bound and determined to hold.
Now, you've just won a legal petition. Can you describe?
Well, yes. International Forest Products earlier this year pushed 3 kilometers in an illegal logging road. They didn't follow the Forest Practices Code, and we've used that one tooth in the bite of the Forest Practices Code to demand that justice, and we've taken International Forest Products to court, and we argue that that was an illegal logging road they put in there, and we want justice. The Forest Practices Code is a new law, and it remains to be seen, how well environmentalists can use the law to get justice for the forest. But we will leave no stone unturned until we get the Stoltman Wilderness preserved.
Can you tell us about the first day you went into the end of the logging road? You were totally aghast. What did you see?
Well, I had been, like everyone else, I had some hope for the Forest Practices Code. And when I went into the end of the logging road, into the Stoltman Wilderness, right there where the road ends and you start walking up the Delahunt Valley for the first time, I saw a clear cut over 100 hectares in size. Now, we're just getting used to hectares. Hectares have been around for a long time, but most people still think in acres. 100 hectares is a gash in the forest, 1 kilometer long by 1 kilometer wide. It is a massive, massive area. In this case, blackened stumps, eroding creeks, the absolute opposite thing that you see in the government brochures. The government says these things aren't happening anymore, and yet there at the end of the Delahunt logging road is the most god-awful thing you've ever seen.
Now, you've been working on a trail. Can you tell us what it's like in there? And there's a special tree in there, and probably many more. What's it like?
Well, it's like going back in time. This is the Lower Mainland's biggest wild area, which means it gives people an opportunity to kind of get a feel of what this area was once like. We've found the Douglas fir tree in there that's 30 feet around. It's this massive tree. There's one area where the trail loops through a grove of all these big old Douglas firs. And we know from looking at the stumps in the clear cuts just before the Stoltman Wilderness that these are 1,000-year-old trees. Beautiful big cedar trees, all these little creeks and lush ferns, full of wildlife. The Delahunt River cuts through a canyon that's 200 feet deep, and now we've built these suspension bridges across the side creeks where our volunteers have used ropes and aluminum ladders strung together to form the base of the bridge. So you have these mini Lionsgate bridges along the footpath. And we have a hiking guide if people would like to pick that up.
Does the trail connect up to Meager Creek?
You can hike for 3 days if you're real fast, or 5 days if you want to take your time. And you start at the Delahunt Valley, north of Squamish, and you come out at British Columbia's largest hot springs, Meager Creek Hot Springs. It's a beautiful, beautiful hike.
Now, they're actually logging at the springs, I hear, too.
They're logging everywhere around the outside of this. I mean, the Stoltman Wilderness is defined by, that's where the wilderness starts, and all around the outside of it are these horrible big clear cuts. And Meager Creek's no different. For those people who like to go to Meager Creek, it's been a real heartbreaker. This is a place on par with Banff for beauty. And the government has allowed these gyppo logging companies to go in there and just thrash that valley.
Now, this was put before a commission made up of environmental groups, industry groups, government groups, REPAC, I believe it was called. You weren't happy with the process. Can you tell us why? And you're not happy, obviously, with the results as far as the Delahunt.
Well, it's the committee that this committee the government put together was called the Regional Public Advisory Committee, but there was nothing public about it. The government handpicked some environment groups to sit on it, but mostly it was the IWA, the logging companies, the mining representatives, and this was the committee to choose the parks for the Lower Mainland, Canada's fastest growing community.
Now, don't they argue that there were environmental groups involved?
Yes, they argue that there were environmental groups. The problem was they were hand-picked groups, government-friendly groups. The Wilderness Committee, for instance, the largest membership-based group in the Lower Mainland. We've been working on Lower Mainland parks. Now, we call them as we see them. We're not necessarily government-friendly. We were never even asked to sit on this thing. The committee meetings were closed to the public, and there were never any community open house meetings to ask people, where's your favorite beaches? Where's your favorite trails? Now, it's not as if we didn't try. The committee volunteers camped on the legislature lawn for 2 months in an attempt to embarrass the NDP government into holding open house public meetings on our park plans. They never did. I think it's because they were coming up to the election and they didn't want the public involved. So the end result is we get a lousy parks plan. Even worse, now the government's saying that there will never be any more new parks in the Lower Mainland. That's unacceptable.
Well, haven't they actually created more than 12%? And where does that 12% figure come from?
Well, they've created 23 new parks, good parks. We think that's fantastic news. Now we have about 14% of the Lower Mainland's land base set aside in parks. But when we look south of us into Washington, Oregon, and California, they've set aside about the same amount, and they've developed the rest. And the result has been their grizzly is extinct, their wolves are gone, their salmon are almost gone with their fishing fleets tied up. When we look to the north of us, the state of Alaska has set aside 40% of its old-growth forest. They still have their grizzlies, they still have their wolves, and their salmon populations are the envy of the whole coast. We argue that the 12% figure or the 14% figure is too low. We need to set aside enough wild lands to keep this place alive. And therefore, the notion that this is it for parks is one that we don't accept.
One quick question, unrelated, but in a way related. Is it ironic that the GVRD wants to be able to find 3 or 4 environmentalists who are trying to monitor what they're doing when they've been running around with bulldozers in our watersheds?
Well, we have to. I think the public is pretty smart, and just because somebody like me presents themselves as an environmentalist, hi, I'm an environmentalist, don't stop thinking. Listen to what they have to say. Because now more than ever, as people are environmentally active, governments will present, we've got environmental pals here. You listen to what they have to say. There should be no bulldozers in our drinking watersheds. They should get the bulldozers out.
Joe, our time's up. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And good luck on your campaign. Thank you. For Contact and Anderson's Restaurant, I'm Craig Delahunt. Please join us again next time.